Well, I'm really honored to be here with John Meyer today, who is an attorney in Bozeman, Montana, and has taken some very progressive stands regarding saving old growth habitats and species. And today we're going to talk about bison,
Yeah,
right?
bison and clean water.
John opened my eyes to a story as deeply conflicted as the snowdrifts atop Yellowstone National Park. His recent legal challenge to reconsider exclusion of bison from federal lands outside the park is being reviewed.
Been living with a fugitive inside of us,
John Trudell.
like buffalo wild under a buffalo sun, running in a closing in, maddened world, racing against the predators of spirit, in facing off with progress's addictions, civilized destruction's wanting habits.
For context, we went to the Buffalo Field Campaign in support of their work to free the majestic beasts.
And in the bison case, I don't know that it's necessarily good or bad, but what is actually happening is that for a long time, people have romanticized cattle grazing. And you have that guy on the horse out in the middle of the frontier by himself, rounding up his cattle, the cowboy myth. And that's played out for a long time in the press and in the media. And so what's actually happening on the ground in Montana, I'm outside of Yellowstone National Park in Bozeman, and the U.S. Forest Service and the state of Montana are not allowing bison to roam freely on federal land.
Must have put some smiles on some hunters' faces this year. As
Hungry
opposed
for
to
news?
the last several years.
I think it
KBZK.
did. You know, there's a lot of meat to be harvested off of a bison, and you know, really, when you think about it, it's just such a unique opportunity to harvest a wild bison, especially one that comes out of Yellowstone National Park.
Domesticating the natural for harvest, threatened by what nature made free, with civilized rational aggressions, wreaking blood havoc, and no feeling of tomorrow or the ancient, in the plunderings of all our relations, the business of collateral damage, profiteering maximized in the carnage.
For the longest time, they've said that bison carry a disease called brucellosis, and brucellosis makes cattle abort their fetuses. And so it has a huge economic impact on livestock grazing. But when you look at the science behind brucellosis, it's a disease that was brought to the United States in cows. So when the settlers came over, the pilgrims, they brought cows, and the cows transmitted brucellosis to wildlife in Montana and all across the US. And there's never been a documented case of a bison transmitting brucellosis back to a cow.
Devin Oldman, Northern Arapaho.
So what I said in my language was, hello, my relatives. My name is Walks Out of Water. My white man name is Devin Oldman. It's good to be here with you all. For we come to care for the one who brings the thunder, otherwise known as the North American bison. And we come to care for the land. Now, what does that mean when it comes from a conservation standpoint? Is that limited to a subjugated amount of land that's issued by a Department of Livestock corporation that has been established no longer than 120 years ago? The story of the bison is the same as the story of the red man. We've been subjugated. We were slaughtered. Now we're confined to small reservations. So who really is free in this story?
Never once, not a single case of this happening, a wild bison giving brucellosis to a cow. And in the meantime, you have elk migrate all over. And so elk are transmitting brucellosis to cattle all across the state of Montana.
Each spring, the Yellowstone bison must cross Highway 191 to access a safe place for their calves' first steps. Introduction of life to these young buffalo is blaring car horns and speeding semi-trucks. Despite BFC's efforts, 21 have already been hit this year. "2023's intense winter has created thick snow berms, some as high as 5 feet, a barrier for the bison families migrating outside of the park. This drove BFC to action. Working with the Montana Department of Transportation, we have constructed several corridors for these wild migratory animals. As winter thaws, however, the need and urgency for BFC volunteers increases. We need you to help us get the baby bison across this busy highway to safety.
And so we asked the U.S. Park Service and U.S. Forest Service to reconsider where it allows bison to roam, because right now they're not allowed to go much farther than 10 miles outside of Yellowstone National Park. And we said, if there are elk transmitting brucellosis hundreds of miles outside the park, why are we not letting bison roam free hundreds of miles outside of the park on federal land?
Does it mean that we're limited to a small reservation boundary that is existing within fenced off areas in which the Bureau of Indian Affairs dictates to tribes as to where we can place bison? Is that limited to a national park, right? That is small, 2 million acres around, right? Yellowstone National Park. Is it limited to that? Or does that animal deserve to be everywhere as it once was?
And so for a long time, the cowboys say, well, it's brucellosis. We say, well, that's not the case anymore. And so the truth that we're discovering is that if you want to graze a cow and a calf pair on federal land, it costs about $1.44 per month, which is a sweetheart deal. I mean, imagine if you had 2,000 pounds worth of dog and you had to feed them every month. Like I have a 40-pound dog and I'll probably spend $30-40 on food for her every month. So imagine how much it actually costs if you were in the private sector feeding those animals. And so the cowboys are getting a sweetheart deal by grazing on federal land. They can never tell the public that, so they have to make up an excuse for why bison can't be on federal land, because bison and cows compete for the same grass. And they don't want to say that. So they say, well, we have to prevent brucellosis from being spread. And so that's not true. And so now we're in the process of getting bison repopulated across the state of Montana. And so the other issue that prevents bison from being repopulating the state is the hunting. So there are a lot of tribes in northwestern United States that have treaty rights to hunt bison. And so these tribes say, hey, the bison, we know where they go. They all leave Yellowstone National Park in the same two places every single year. So there are 7 or 8 tribes that have treaty rights. They line up right on the boundary of Yellowstone National Park every single year. And as soon as the snow gets too deep, the bison start leaving the park, because the Forest Service land outside the park is a much lower elevation. There's less snow. And so they're looking for grass to eat. And as soon as they get all 4 hooves out of the park, they start getting blasted.
We have a kill box known as Beatty Gulch.
James Holt, Nez
out of
Perce.
the bison management plans processes. The tribe's voices for increased habitat and increased populations have fallen on deaf ears. And they're placed under the condition and the auspices of this bison management plan that utilizes that sacred relationship as a management tool in the eyes of the federal and state agencies, minimizing that sacred relationship that tribes are seeking to establish, publicizing the treaty hunts as vicious and savage because of the conditions that they created as a part of this management scheme. It's unfortunate that we're here today to see these kind of conditions exist where tribes are forced to get on a firing line. Our bison, our brothers, our sacred brothers, are forced to run through this small strip of land in the hopes that they can achieve freedom from disrespectful conditions that exist there on the landscape. And so it is time that we begin in a bigger way to address those federal and state agencies, to push for additional habitat, to push for increased numbers on the landscape, so that we don't have to have those situations where we have cows running back into the park boundaries just to die, to lie dead within the no-go zone.
We come to a time in 2023 whereas private interests are now superseding the authorities of independent nations. Their interests are vested in capitalism, imperialism, the federal dollar, the Federal Reserve notes, the birth certificates, the social security cards, all the privatization of those interests versus your constitutional rights. The treaties that were negotiated off the basis of the United States government and its representatives, formerly known as the Secretary of War, losing those wars to us. 127 treaties that were negotiated on behalf of the losing side, which was not us. And the only provisional requirement of that we've been honoring for 157 years. So that provisional requirement, you want to know what that was? Not killing white people. And we've been doing it. And what are you doing to our relatives? Right? That's my understanding of what conservation is. They should be let free.
As soon as the bison leave the park, we want the hunters to walk behind them and assist them walk behind them. It's like an assisted migration. So for the longest time, the feds in the state of Montana pushed the bison back into Yellowstone National Park using helicopters, horses, four-wheelers, all rubber bullets, all sorts of things. They'd haze them back into Yellowstone National Park.
And then they start to migrate out, and they don't want them out on the national forest.
Mike Meath, co-founder, Buffalo Fuel Campaign.
And so they do what they call hazing, and they forcefully push the buffalo either across the river to habitat they're allowed to be on, or sometimes up to 17 miles all the way back inside Yellowstone National Park.
Montana Department of Livestock agents shoot the buffalo with paintballs. All the agents push the buffalo families into the fast-moving Madison River, hard on the whole herd, after being hazed up to 5 miles before being forced into the river.
Montana's bison hunt for state hunters ended yesterday on the 15th, and so really this year has been kind of an extraordinary year. At least in recent memory, we haven't seen a bison migration to this extent in a long time, and so what that means is a lot of hunters, the vast majority of hunters, especially in the Gardner area, were able to be successful in harvesting bison this year.
And now we're trying to facilitate their migration out of the park into areas where they haven't been in like 100+ years.
We have this relationship that has begun with these other tribes that is a long time coming. So we see a greater encompassing of what we see as self. We see bits and pieces of our own selves coming back to the forefront, of our hearts being whole once again.
And so if we just walk behind them very slowly, let them make up their own pace, whatever they want to do, walk behind them for a couple days, and so ensure no one's going to shoot when you got people with the bison. So I think that's one opportunity where we can help bison restore themselves to Montana and federal land.
Wow, that's a really interesting and creative solution.
and it turns, an old paradigm on its head. And I think that's interesting. And the opportunity to give people an aha moment of, hey, we can do things better here and better for the land and the animals and the people. Isn't it true that buffalo, because of their hooves, are better for the land and create a higher level of biodiversity and prairie?
They will turn up land, but they don't congregate in one spot the same way that cows do. So cattle will find a water spot and they'll just hole up right there and trample everything. That's why you see rivers that are just destroyed. The stream beds, the banks are destroyed by the cows. And bison are always moving, so that doesn't happen. They'll turn up soil and they'll move to a different place.
Well, that's a really great project to describe for our audience, to give them an understanding of the nature of your work and how important it is to species and to people. Now, on a slightly different tack, can you talk about the Gallatin River and the Yellowstone Club and what's going on there?
Sure. So the Gallatin River is in southwest Montana. There was a movie, River Runs Through It. It was filmed on the Gallatin River. It's a beautiful river. It's an amazing place. There's good whitewater rafting. There's good fishing. There's good hiking in that area. It's an amazing place. And so the secret about Montana is out, and more people are wanting to buy a slice of heaven in the Big Sky area. And there's a private resort in Big Sky called the Yellowstone Club. That's where the Bill Gates and the Tom Brady's and the well-to-do have vacation houses. And Big Sky has a problem in that there's nowhere for them to dispose of their treated sewage. And so most towns get a permit from the US EPA or the state, and that allows them to discharge their treated effluent into the river. But in Big Sky, the tributaries of the Gallatin River are already so polluted that there are no permits available. And so we went and looked at, why are these rivers polluted? And so we hiked up into the stream. So in Montana, you're allowed to hike below the high water mark. And so a couple of us went into a stream below the high water mark, hiked for miles into the heart of this private resort called the Yellowstone Club, and found a stream coming off their private property. I said, oh, that's interesting. So we took water samples and found that it's super high nitrogen, which is a telltale sign of treated sewage. And so we then took algae samples, and as we were hiking out, we got back to the trailhead, and the sheriff was there saying, what are you guys doing? We said, well, we were taking samples and we did some fishing. He said, okay, you guys ever went above the high water mark? We said, no. And the sheriff said, okay, have a good day. And then 6 months later, I get criminal trespass charges from the state of Montana. They're saying you criminally trespassed by collecting these water samples and watching contractors for Cottonwood Environmental Law Center collect water samples. I said, that's not true, because in Montana, we're allowed to go below the high water mark. And so we fought them off, and we won. The court dismissed the criminal trespass case against me. And so now we have filed a federal Clean Water Act case against the Yellowstone Club for discharging its treated sewage directly into the river without a permit. We've asked the court to stop development and construction in the Yellowstone Club because they cannot get a permit. And so for me, this is somewhat symbolic in that we are coming up to the edges of our natural world. We just don't have the resources anymore. 100 years ago, it was the big wide open West. You can do whatever you want. And today, we're running out of room. We're running out of space. And so we're trying to address this idea that overconsumption is real and is having an impact on our natural resources. And the U.S. economy is based so much on consumption and the markets. And we're trying to say, hey, we need to think about how we're going to reconfigure the U.S. economy in such a way that's not dependent upon consumption, because the Gallatin River, the Western United States just can't handle this sort of unbridled consumption of vacation houses and all that sort of thing. And so it's a tough it's a tough issue, but it's meaningful and it's really important for everyone. If we want to address climate change, we need to address overconsumption. That's, I think, a major driver of our climate crisis is overconsumption. And I drive a car. I have a truck, a 6-cylinder truck. So, and nobody's perfect, right? I mean, we're all flawed. We're all human. But I think that by saying that, I'm allowed to then talk about the issues that we're looking at as a species. And I'm open to people saying, "Hey, you can be more, you can conserve more resources by doing this or that." I'm certainly open to any ideas and feedback that people have. I just want to start that conversation with people so that we can really address a problem that people aren't discussing in politics, at least.
You're not the typical liberal bleeding heart tree hugger.
My mom was the first female day laborer at a steel mill. So she cut slabs of steel in Bethlehem Steel with a torch in Northwest Indiana, right outside of Gary, Indiana. Yeah.
John, I just really appreciate your commitment and what you've been willing to share with people about your work. And is there anything else you'd like to discuss about our lives here on the fragile planet?
It's really easy to get angry. And I don't think that anger is a sustainable fuel source. I think that we need to have some compassion. And that's really hard when you're fighting what feels like these giant monsters with a lot of money. But I think that at the end of the day, it's going to take love and loving people that you might not think you do. But I think that at the end of the day, it takes us all working together. And so if we want to work through the problems, we have to talk about them. And I think that's gonna take some compassion.
Now, you ran for mayor of
I did.
Bozeman.
I just lost recently. I got out, and this is my ego talking right now. I got outspent 3-1 and I did not lose by that much. So yeah, I feel good about what I did. I wouldn't take any money from any developers. And so often you see the plastic yard signs being thrown out, and I refused to have any plastic yard sign printed. So we went to a local hardware store and they had scrap piles of wood, and we took a bunch of their scrap plywood and then painted my last name Meyer on the signs, and Meyer for mayor. And so there were a bunch of hand painted Meyer signs all across Bozeman, which was fun. It was good.
That's really thoughtful. I've seen those plastic signs. I've worked on campaigns. I know the material, and
In a week after they're done, they just go right to landfill.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you, and I hope we get to do it again pretty soon. Let me know when you win.
Federal court on February 5th is having an injunction hearing to decide whether or not development in the Yellowstone Club is going to be stopped to protect the Yellowstone River. So I'll check back with you then. Any letters to the US EPA, if you know anybody in EPA, if you know anybody in the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, tell them that you love our Yellowstone River and you love our US rivers, and ask them to stop the polluters from polluting.